This week's required reading was Chapter 4 of Blogging, titled Citizen Journalists? Online writing is transforming the news industry. How do we get news now versus how people got it in the past? Can bloggers and other online writers be considered journalists? Let's examine Journalism Online. I hope you were able to also read a few additional articles that I shared with you. If not, let me know, and I'll send you the links again. The first article is from Wired magazine. It's called Eyewitness Tweets by Eric Stewart. In this day and age, as practically everyone has a smartphone or other mobile device that allows them to take pictures and video and also easily share it online, ordinary citizens are capturing newsworthy events and posting it for all the world to see. In the next article, Rachel Carlson wrote for the Journalistics website how journalism has changed since the 9/11 disaster. She argues that the emergence of Web 2.0, in which everyone has the capacity to create user-generated content, we have all become journalists. In the final article, Pete Bosak, a professional reporter, counter-argues on his Charlotte PR blog that no, citizens are not all journalists. They are just glorified witnesses who happen to be in the right or wrong place at the right or wrong time, and now have the technology to record what they see and hear and distribute it, no more, no less. In the past, people experienced historic events through traditional media: the JFK assassination, the moon landing, the Challenger space shuttle explosion, the Y2K celebration, and the 9/11 attacks. Now, people have the ability to capture their own footage of major events, such as the plane crash in the Hudson River or the Boston Marathon bombing. Carlson has a point that there has been a dramatic shift in the news industry, but Bosak is also right in arguing that not all so-called cyberjournalists live up to the criteria of true journalism. Let's take a look. Journalism is defined as the occupation of reporting, writing, editing, photographing, or broadcasting news, or of conducting any news organization as a business. Jill Walker-Redberg explains that you don't need a particular degree or license to call yourself a journalist, as you would to call yourself a doctor, a lawyer, or a psychologist. Instead, you call yourself a journalist if you work as a journalist. Until very recently, that meant that you published your writing in a newspaper or a magazine, or that you worked in television or radio. Today, this may also mean that you are a blogger. Journalism as we know it today had its origins in 1456 when Johann Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press. It allowed for mass printing and distribution of published content. Before that, news was spread orally, or through horseback delivery of handwritten missives as kings and other leaders communicated the old-fashioned way with their empires. The printing press allowed for quick, easy, affordable mass printing and distribution. In 1594, the first printed periodical, a publication that is issued at regularly recurring intervals, was distributed in what is now Germany, Mercurius Gallobelgicus, written in Latin. Unlike other one-shot printed material, this was an ongoing publication. Readers expected new issues to be printed at regular times. In 1623, the earliest example of a news book, published in 8 to 24-page quarto formats, titled The Continuation of Our Weekly News, appeared regularly in London. Suddenly, people were printing what we call news and sharing it with readers. The quarto format, illustrated here, is sort of how print newspapers and magazines and even some books are created today. To save time and space, the printing press often runs big sheets that print multiple pages, which are then cut or folded. This means that publishers need to fill all those pages with content. In 1665, the first newspaper published in English, the Oxford Gazette, later named the London Gazette, appeared in England. It wasn't daily. It had a sporadic but frequent schedule. In 1702, the first daily newspaper, the Daily Courant, appeared in England. It later merged with the Daily Gazetteer in 1735 and lasted under various names until 1797. In 1721, the first American colonial newspaper, the New England Courant, published by James Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's brother, was distributed. Benjamin Franklin worked with James as a typesetter and an anonymous writer. In 1729, a year after moving to Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin took over the Pennsylvania Gazette, which became the hottest newspaper in the colonies. Printed newspapers became an important way for the colonies to communicate and spread ideas about independence. The growth of American newspapers was a key contributor to the Revolution. By 1750, in the 6 largest American colonies, 14 weekly newspapers were published, the most popular and successful appearing up to 3 times a week. In the 1770s, in 35 American colonial cities, 89 newspapers were published. By 1800, about 234 newspapers were being published in the United States of America. Early newspapers were opinionated, blatantly partisan, and openly copied content from other publications. In 1791, the First Amendment to the Constitution, protecting freedom of the press and other freedoms, was approved. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, etc. The Founding Fathers recognized the importance played by the press in reaching their independence, so they made sure to protect that fourth estate. Even if we disagreed with what was being said, the people should have the right to express it. In 1833, The Sun, a newspaper in New York, debuted, becoming the first to popularize the idea of human interest stories, presenting people and their problems, concerns, or achievements in a way that brings about sympathy in the reader or viewer. Human interest stories are still in journalism, sometimes criticized as soft news or manipulative, sensationalistic programming meant to sell copies or boost ratings. The Sun survived until 1950 and was then resurrected in 2002 as the New York Sun. It ceased print publication in 2008 but continues as an online edition at nysun.com. As American cities like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Washington grew with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, so did newspapers. Larger printing presses, the telegraph, and other technological innovations allowed newspapers to print thousands of copies, boost circulation, and increase revenue. Technology helped the newspaper industry grow. The production line, factory system of printing, the telephone for communication, the railroad for delivery versus the Pony Express of years before, all made the news business a major industrial force. In 1835, the New York Herald, the first publication to fit the description of a modern newspaper, was founded by James Gordon Bennett Sr. We can call it the first modern newspaper because it was the first newspaper to have city staff covering regular beats and spot news, along with regular business and Wall Street coverage. Regular beats describe covering certain specific topics such as politics, crime, education, and so on. Spot news is breaking news, going out and reporting on what's happening now. In 1838, for the New York Herald, Bennett organized the first foreign correspondence staff of 6 men in Europe and assigned domestic correspondents to key cities, including the first reporter to regularly cover Congress. These practices are still part of newspaper setups today. In 1841, the New York Tribune, the first newspaper to gain national prominence, was founded, edited by Horace Greeley. Within 20 years, it was shipping thousands of copies to other large cities, leading other major newspapers to do the same. News became more than just a local matter. People were interested in reading about what was happening in other parts of the country and around the world. In 1886, the New York Tribune began using the linotype machine in its printing process, which rapidly increased the speed and accuracy with which type could be set. In 1851, the New York Times was founded by George Jones and Henry Raymond, originally as the New York Daily Times. Before color print newspapers, the New York Times was nicknamed the Gray Lady. It looked almost mimeographed. Syndication was the next step for journalism. Wire services were developed to meet the growing demand for more news stories by urban newspapers whose staff reporters could not keep up with the amount of news their readers were expecting to read. The first was a cooperative between 6 New York-based newspapers that shared coverage of Europe. In 1858, what became the Associated Press received the first transmission ever of European news through the transatlantic cable. In 1871, a famous example of the emergence of investigative journalism took place. The New York Herald sent reporter Henry Morton Stanley on an African expedition where he found the missing professor David Livingstone and allegedly uttered those famous words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." In 1887, James Bennett Gordon Jr. became the first American newspaper publisher to launch a European version, spinning off his New York Herald into the Paris Herald, which would eventually become the International Herald Tribune, and now the International New York Times. New York had a lot of newspapers. In 1883, William Randolph Hearst launched the New York Journal. Then in 1896, Joseph Pulitzer launched the New York World. The competition between the newspaper owners led to the development of yellow journalism, which relied on eye-catching, headline-grabbing stories rather than well-researched news to attract an audience. To counter this, we see the emergence of muckraking, more investigative reporting, and greater risks to advance social causes becoming popular, especially among smaller publications competing with larger dailies. The Nation, the oldest continuously published news magazine weekly, the New Republic news magazine, Time magazine, founded by Britton Hayden and Henry Luce, Newsweek, the United States News magazine, which merged with World Report to become U.S. News and World Report, the Village Voice in Manhattan's Greenwich Village, the Phoenix in Boston, all came into being to present in-depth news articles that the tabloid newspapers had abandoned. Mass electronic media competition took over starting in the 1920s. Radio began competing with print as a mass medium delivering news right to consumers' homes. In the 1930s to the 1940s, newsreels shown in movie theaters before or after a feature film offered a new visual view of the news. In the 1950s, people began to turn to television for the news. In the 1970s to the 1980s, computers began to revolutionize how news was gathered and reported. The power of the press emerged as media impacted presidential elections, the civil rights movement, international policy, and other major events. News media brought the country together during crises and divided them over major issues. What you see here are examples of the impact of traditional media news. President Kennedy's televised debates, charismatic press conferences, and assassination. The civil rights movement protests, marches, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. President Nixon exposed by the Washington Post over the Watergate scandal and forced to resign. The Vietnam War and journalist Walter Cronkite bringing the hell of war right into viewers' living rooms. In the 1980s, CNN was born, bringing with it a 24-hour news cycle. In the 1990s, online news became the latest, most powerful way to read about and share current events and the issues of the day. Today, citizen journalists are blogging and tweeting just as many scoops, if not more, than traditional journalists. Repberg quotes Melissa Wall, "The values that anchored modernity were reflected in journalism, a sense that reality could be observed and documented from an objective viewpoint, an emphasis on constant change and timeliness, and a belief in being able to represent reality accurately. That's what traditional journalism was perceived to be. Journalists had to be objective, the world was constantly delivering newsworthy change, and traditional media were capturing and delivering what they wanted the passive audience to believe was true reality. The profession of journalism and our idea of news developed as recently as the 19th century, becoming a commodity that could be sold and resold. It was a business to sell news and make money from those who wanted news, or from the advertisers who wanted to reach that audience. During the 20th century, journalism further developed in order to reach the largest number of people. One strategy was that of presenting the news as objective, a detached, neutral report that usually included a counterpoint of view to any controversy, so as to offend the fewest people possible, and therefore sell as many news copies as possible. The big problem with modern traditional journalism is that in reducing discussions to two binary points of view, alternative perspectives would often disappear. Traditional media became businesses motivated by profit and the need to reach the largest audiences possible. So a gatekeeping system was established to determine what stories would be worth printing and broadcasting, limiting the variety of choices available to the usually passive public. Fringe news and niche markets were served only by much smaller outlets that didn't have the reach or power of the big traditional media. Redberg writes, although freedom of speech was recognized as an important human right in the 20th century, in practice, only a tiny percentage of the population in 20th century democracies could easily share their ideas with more than the people immediately surrounding them. New media have altered the perception of what journalism can and should be. Classic modern characteristics of journalism are being replaced by postmodernist ideas seen in blogs and other online writing, and the creation of user-generated content, such as personalization, audience participation in content discussion and creation, and new story forms that are fragmented and interdependent with other stories, whether online or from traditional media. Redberg continues, the internet changed one of the greatest obstacles to true freedom of the press by eliminating or greatly reducing the cost of production and distribution. Blogs provide a means of publishing and distributing that is cheap and simple enough for everyone in the world to use directly, whether from home, school, the library, or even a mobile phone. How has the internet changed traditional journalism? News is now less of a commodity. There are less profit motives. News can now be accessed anywhere. News can now be accessed anytime. Now it is easier to provide commentary on the news. Now the general public can report the news. Redberg writes, this new freedom to publish at will has caused journalists and editors to reevaluate the role of mainstream professional media. As blogs became a familiar genre, the mainstream media began to discuss whether blogging was a threat to journalism and to the media as we have known them throughout the 20th century. Journalists began to ask a question that kept recurring. Is blogging journalism? There are ways that, yes, blogging does intersect with journalism. Blogs can give first-hand reports from ongoing events, whether wars, natural disasters, or crimes. Some bloggers set out to tell stories that might just as well have been told by traditional journalists, filling in where mainstream press have failed or provided insufficient coverage. In some cases, blogs provide independent-minded journalists with a printing press of their own, free of any editor, such as this example by John Simon, a former New York Magazine critic. Many bloggers follow mainstream media and other blogs and filter stories according to their interests, or they carefully monitor every news item about a particular person or issue. These writers are often called filter bloggers or gatewatchers, who amplify niche or fringe stories. Traditional media act as gatekeepers of information, a regime of control over what content is allowed to emerge from the production processes in the print and broadcast industries. The controllers of these media control the gates through which content is released to their audiences. Gatekeeping effectively keeps traditional journalism a closed process. All the news is inside the barbed wire fence, with only bits and pieces released to the public when the gatekeepers determine what is worthy of being shared with the masses. There are different stages of gatekeeping in traditional media. The input phase is where news is gathered only by staff journalists hired by the traditional media outlet. The output phase is where news is published, a closed editorial hierarchy that restricts the content. The response phase is where the audience comments on the news, but there is an editorial selection of which comments to make public, and often tedious hurdles to get comments to reach the appropriate gatekeepers in traditional media. The closed system is collapsing in today's world of participatory media. Bloggers represent a turn from the gatekeeping that the mass media has traditionally performed to gate watching. Mainstream media filters the type of news that professional journalists, producers, and editors deem worthy to publish or broadcast. And now blogs filter the types of traditional news that online writers deem worthy to share, discuss, criticize, and/or build upon. Let's quickly look at the main differences between mainstream media, which are print, TV, and radio, and new media, which are blogs, podcasts, and web video. Mainstream media allegedly have professional standards, whereas new media have an amateur perception. Mainstream media often require professional training, while new media have a reputation of having practitioners who are self-taught. In mainstream, career advancements are part of the structure, while new media are dominated by personal interests rather than career goals. There is a professional hierarchy in mainstream media, while new media depend upon peer review. Mainstream media are associated with reliability, while new media thrive on reputation. In mainstream media, we hear talk of authority, while new media is all about transparency. We talked about mainstream media's dependence on objectivity, while new media are characterized as being all about subjectivity. Mainstream is expensive, and new media is relatively cheap or free. There are often monetary rewards in mainstream media, at least there were, while new media have what are called monetization challenges. Mainstream depends on audience size, while in new media, audience size is often irrelevant. In mainstream, accessibility is key, meant for all to hear the message that are being delivered, while new media focus on common legitimacy, targeted messages, but still the potential to go mainstream viral. Mainstream lives and breathes for the broad audience. Traditional media want many people to easily receive content, paid for directly or through the advertisers, but not necessarily have direct input in that content. The more people buy it, that's all that usually counts. New media have the potential to reach everyone, but usually reach only people with similar interests. Even if it sparks debate and discussion, the more the better, because it legitimizes the writer as someone whose thoughts and ideas are powerful enough to matter. Mainstream media have established legal rights, whereas the legal rights in new media are still emerging. Mainstream media are time-sensitive and time-dependent, with specific deadlines, while new media have virtual immediacy. Repberg says, recently proposed legal definitions show the shift that is occurring in our understanding of what a journalist is. Journalism is no longer exclusively defined according to the medium in which a person reports, but rather the definition is growing significantly broader and not necessarily tied to a specific medium. She continues, blogging and other forms of online writing and user-created media are causing us to redefine the nature of journalism itself. Here are some traditional practices of professional journalism that can be found in online writing. Directly quoting sources. Fact-checking. Posting corrections. Receiving permission to use copyrighted material. Providing evidence and examples to support theories and speculation. Like traditional media, new media are looking for ways to build trust and credibility. Traditional media embrace objectivity and authority through institutional credibility, building trust through professional standards. New media embrace subjectivity and independence through personal authenticity, building trust individually. Traditional media are seeing the handwriting on the wall as more people are getting their news online. So traditional media are turning to online media tactics to keep audiences. From network television and radio to local newscasts, traditional news outlets are experimenting with becoming more casual and opinionated to attract viewers who see blogs as more credible than the mainstream press. Take, for example, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and The Colbert Report. News networks are using visual techniques inspired by new media, such as ticker news displays, open forum discussions, the use of viewer-submitted audio and video, and so on. Journalists are increasingly presenting themselves as participants in events, rather than assuming they can stay outside. If you're in New York, check out WPIX Channel 11 News at 10, and you'll see how the on-air journalists are molding themselves to be like video bloggers instead of the traditional idea of objective reporters. Traditional media, from radio to newspapers and magazines to movies and television programs, have supplemented their mainstream content with material online, websites, social media, blogs, and user-generated content sharing sites. Marketers and traditional media practitioners are recognizing the power of new media and are actively developing and implementing plans and executing techniques to spread their message beyond traditional channels and into the blogosphere. Blogs and mainstream media, however, are in many ways symbiotic. They need each other. New media still frequently depend on information and sources from large mainstream media for their content ideas and for their exposure to larger audiences. Likewise, traditional media are more frequently turning to blogs, social networks, and user-generated content to add credibility to their stories and to spread their messages. Symbiosis means codependency, mutually beneficial, and that's what traditional and new media are to each other. So that's my overview of what I call cyberjournalism. What do you think? What does the future of journalism hold? Maybe that's something to consider talking about in your final papers.